We're going to talk about some behaviors and patterns that can show up for us in just a few moments. But I wanted to highlight this fawn response because it is a survival response, just like fight, flight, and freeze. And the behaviors associated with it often get confused for our personality traits. And that is often so much a part of our trauma work and our healing from our mother wound, is really separating out and untangling who we are from how we learn to survive. So let's talk a little bit about what some of these behaviors actually look like in the here and now. One that we've already hit on is this hyper attunement, hyper awareness to change in other people's moods and behaviors. We become expert at monitoring, and this brings such hypervigilance into our bodies to be alert in this way all the time. And it can also make us incredibly empathic. But this is more than being empathic, because being empathic doesn't inherently mean giving up ourselves, but the fawn response does. Adapting to seek your mother's love and approval comes at the cost of ourselves. Another common behavior is having difficulty setting boundaries, asserting your needs and your preferences. So much of the time we might anticipate the response being that it's unimportant, that it's a burden, that it's unwelcome, that it will cause conflict, that we just need to be agreeable with what everyone else wants. Sometimes we've been doing this for so long that we actually don't have a sense of what we want, like, or need. And as a result, this can also lead us to be incredibly over-accommodating or even over-apologetic. And this is why so many of us might fall into caretaking roles in our relationships. As a result of that caretaking, we might overgive to the point that we actually not getting our needs met, even if we don't quite know what our needs are. And we start building up a reservoir of resentment inside of us. And this is a really tricky place to be, because that resentment has to go somewhere eventually. And oftentimes it will build up to the point that it will explode or come out sideways at some point. And the guilt that we then have about taking up so much space or reacting in a negative way sends us right back into this cycle where we continue to overgive and people please and overaccommodate. As I mentioned before, growing up with some of these dynamics with our mother can lead us to be completely disconnected from ourselves and disconnected from our sense of self-trust. If we are constantly forfeiting our needs, having to distance from our emotions, we get cut off from the body, because your emotions are held in the body. And it can leave us feeling really untethered, full of self-doubt, where you might find that you often have to ask a lot of people for input before you make a decision. You might have trouble discerning what's anxiety versus what's a gut feeling. And for some, this might actually lead you into a dynamic with your mother where she is the source of that validation for you, where you continue to need her approval for whatever choices you're making in your life. Other common behaviors that we might struggle with as part of all this adaptation is just generally overfunctioning. Could be in your relationships, could also be at work. So much of this is tied to our self-worth, that I'm only as worthy as what I can do for someone or how I can take care of someone. All sorts of things around perfectionism, where it feels so threatening to make a mistake or not get it just right. And all of this comes back to what your nervous system remembers. We have our conscious memory, of course, but we also have our unconscious or our implicit memory that's held in the nervous system. So, for example, the experience of making a mistake, if historically with your mother, that was something that brought on a lot of criticism or shame or punishment, your nervous system remembers that. So even if you're out of that situation, out of that dynamic now, if you're in a scenario where you don't do it just right, your nervous system can get incredibly activated, remembering how unsafe that felt in the past. Another big one that many of us struggle with is keeping quiet to keep the peace. Sometimes we do actually know what we feel. We do know what we want to say, but we shove it way down in service of not causing any waves. And another behavior that can come from that is minimizing our own feelings. You might become your own best gaslighter of your feelings. Was it really that bad? Was it that big of a deal? Was I really that upset about that? And so much of this comes from what we've internalized from how our mother interacted with us around our emotional experiences, that this becomes our own inner self-talk. And ultimately, what so many of us fear with this mother wound is fear of conflict and fear of abandonment. So important to remember, if you're resonating with these, to be really gentle and compassionate with yourself. These are not flaws in you. These are survival adaptations. This is how you best learn to navigate your relationship with your mother. And for so many of us, because of that earlier conditioning, you may have found yourself in later friendships, romantic relationships, all sorts of circumstances that reinforced a lot of this throughout your life. It's so important to notice, though, how sometimes our own self-abandonment reinforces that our true self is unworthy of love. So if you'd like to hit the pause button right now, this could be a great time for you to just kind of go back through that list we went through and reflect on which of these experiences you resonate with. For some of you, you might notice that there used to be some of these behaviors and patterns that you identify with, but you've been working to heal those. And now not all of them resonate with you. And that is so important because these take time, and they take commitment, and it's a process, but worth acknowledging if there has been some progress made here. And if this is the first time that you're discovering some of these things about yourself, again, having a really light touch here, because this is a younger version of you that was working so hard to protect you from pain and abandonment. In addition to some of the behaviors and patterns that I just went through, one of the most profound and long-lasting impacts of this kind of motherhood is the deep guilt and shame that we carry. In so many ways, as children, you have to unconsciously bond with a sense of shame as a way to gain your mother's approval. What that means is that that shame doesn't just dissipate after that rupture or that argument is over. It stays with you. It becomes fused with who you are. And as a result, we often blame ourselves, whether in childhood or adulthood. If you're still in these dynamics with your mother, we internalize blame for being emotionally neglected or for conditional love. You might feel guilty for having needs, emotions, desires, and the experience of chronically failing to meet our mother's expectations, despite all of our efforts to self-abandon, can leave us feeling incredibly guilty and feeling not good enough.